I think I'll be a little briefer today in this chapter as we look to probably the most difficult topic of all. I found it to be very uh, made me uncomfortable. And I've said that a lot, I know, as we go through this, but that is part of it. There are two people that I know for sure that are appreciative of us doing this together. There are a lot of people who are not even going to attempt it, not looking at it, not dealing with it, or criticizing it and attacking it in many ways. I certainly hope it is not affecting the support of the church for me doing this, but I am convinced in the bottom of my heart and with the conviction of the Holy Spirit that if we could do this together, it would bring us closer to a new future, to a new way of looking at how to move forward. But I gotta say, I'm not optimistic about that. I do get down in the dumps about it at times because it's been such a difficult road to hoe. I never realized until I got into this at this stage of my life how ingrained and difficult it is. Let me start off with a movie that I enjoyed and you might have enjoyed as well. I want to look at it now from our author's side of things. I'm kind of going from the back of the chapter back to the front, but this is a way for us to get into it. It's called The Blind Side, Sandra Bullock movie. She received an Academy Award for it. And it says that the film is an example of whites as the racially benevolent side of the coin. It's based on a true story of a family, and they rescued a black man, Michael Orr, who came from an impoverished family. And what the author is accusing the story of, and I've realized this about other movies, The Green Mile, the Help. There were several movies like that where we see the white benevolence helping rescue the person out of their blackness or out of their black culture. The other side of that coin that I'm familiar with is you have the wise black friend, the sidekick, who's always there to support the aspirations and the desires and the goals of whatever white person is the star of the movie. It's an interesting concept. I invite you to at least consider it. But here's what she says about this. The only way Orr, the boy, the young football star, could be saved from the terrors of his own black community was through the benevolence of a white family. Because there were all sorts of negative racial stereotypes presented in this. This is the take of the author about this. She said, sprinkled in all through this is that, first of all, Orr is presented as mentally slight, not quite there, childlike. He lives in abject poverty, and we've already discussed this. That's maybe something that's ingrained in the nature of the culture which we dominate. Sprinkled in are his drug-addicted single mother with multiple children from unknown fathers, the typical welfare queen, incompetent welfare worker, uppity lawyer, the menacing gang members in his drug-infested and crime-ridden neighborhood. Not saying those scenarios don't exist, but what she's saying is that the way this presents it, all of them look like this. All black communities look like this. So she says that it took the white family to rescue this good black man out of his bad black culture. The white professionals were also talking to him about that he really wasn't very teachable, but he did have a protective instinct, and they actually used that. And the author says, I've never heard of a test that evaluates a protective instinct or instincts in general. But it was better to look at this young black man as more animalistic in their approach to him. According to the film, Orr is never able to understand the rules of the game. So the way they get him to play football well is to give him the protective instinct, particularly protecting the white family members that might be hurt. And once those instincts are engaged, he becomes the consummate football player. She says, in a particularly insulting scene, the white child in the family who tried unsuccessfully to teach Orr how to play football sits at a table negotiating a contract for him with powerful adult men, while Orr sits in the background mute. So she lists a couple of things from the white perspective that give out some dominant ideologies. Listen to these. White people are the saviors of black people. Some black children may be innocent, but black adults are morally and criminally corrupt. You may not agree with these conclusions. They were chafing to me. I didn't see them as being like nobody made this list before they made the movie and said, we're going to do this. But she said, whites who are willing to save or otherwise help black people at great personal cost are very noble, courageous, and morally superior to other whites. Individual black people can overcome their circumstances, but usually, what? Only with the help of white people. Black neighborhoods are inherently dangerous and criminal. Virtually all blacks are poor, incompetent, unqualified. They belong to gangs, are addicted to drugs, and they are obviously bad parents. The most dependable route for black males to escape the inner city is through sports. White people are willing to deal with deserving black people, but whites do not become part of the black community in any meaningful way beyond charity work. So, the last thing she says is that it incorporated again that the Miss Tuhoney, I think, is a Christian claiming it was God's will this boy be saved, and then the author gives this conclusion, well, perhaps that's because his talent on the field made him more profitable and therefore valuable to all people, but particularly to white people, to the college he would go to. And so the good whites are dealing with the prejudice of the individual bad whites that they encounter at the country club and at the other places. And it keeps this binary going. Racist equals bad, not racist equals good. And what she's doing in this chapter is she says she considers this film fundamentally and insidiously white, anti-black. Anti-black. And again, what she's pulling out, what she's exposing or tearing back and asking us to look into, do we indeed feel this way, act this way? I've never come across a successful white business person that doesn't have their welfare queen story or their what is the other thing, the food stamp story about somebody who doesn't appreciate it, who tries to game it, or who is using it and living better than we're living because of it. And I do believe with all my heart that the people living on food stamps, on welfare, whatever terminology you want to give it, they do not live well. Now, they may live and they may have learned to game it in some way, shape, or form, but they don't live well. I was very disturbed this week to hear a spokesperson for the not the riot, but the protest movements in Chicago speaking to the fact that the looting was not a problem, and that's one of those issues where those are the whole cause gets ripped away from them because of their because there are people who use these situations for their own advantage. So the whole chapter 6, anti-blackness, talks about the deeper subconscious percolating side of things for us as white people to consider. It says here that to challenge the ideologies of racism as individualism, colorblindness, we as white people must suspend our perception of ourselves as unique and outside of race. We are as engaged in race as the white culture that we grew up in. We can't see ourselves as only individuals. White people are a group, and we belong to that group. Racial generalization also reinforces something problematic for people of color. It's a continual focus on their group identity. There are, I think even Vice President, the presidential candidate Biden got in trouble for making it sound like that all black people think and act in a block. They're all part of the same cultural mindset. And that is challenged in this chapter as well. There are specific ways that different groups experience racism. And even for people of color, there are variations depending on their history. You have not only African American or black people. If you describe the first thing you see about a person, are they black, are they Asian, are they indigenous, Native American? There are myriad groups, also subgroups within those categories. So she was saying that her stereotypes about Japanese people are not the same as her stereotypes about Chinese people. But she says, today I want to address uniquely anti-black sentiment. In the white mind, black people are the ultimate racial other. So she says, I remind my readers, I'm addressing white people at a societal level, the culture that we live in, not the individual. But on the macro level, I recognize that and she's saying that she and herself, and that each of us have to plumb the depths of our attitudes and see, do we carry with us deep anti-black feelings? Do these sentiments arise when I pass black strangers on the street, when I see stereotype depictions of black people in the media, when I hear thinly veiled warnings and jokes passed between white people? These are deeper feelings that I need to be willing to examine, for these feelings can and do seep out without my awareness, and they hurt those whom I love. So she's looking here, she says, creating a separate and inferior black race simultaneously created a superior white race. That's an interesting concept, that for us to see someone as inferior means that we immediately are able to look at ourselves as superior. One concept cannot exist without the other. So in that sense, for that to work, white people need black people. It's essential. Blackness is essential to our white identity if we are dominant and if we certainly see ourselves as superior. So she begins to list some of the issues that each of us need to ask ourselves. Do we feel this way? Do we really behave? Or is this deep in our subconscious? Africans, black people as lazy and childlike. The movie presented the man as childlike. Apparently that was not accurate. Today, do we depict blacks or think of blacks as dangerous? Pervert the true direction of violence, because the real truth of the matter is in her statements that violence typically goes from white towards black more than it does black towards white. You'll have to struggle with that characterization as well. This causes aversion and hostility towards black people. There's a collective consciousness, she believes, that an individual white person may not be explicitly aware of these feelings. You may not feel this way, or it may be deeper than you are willing to plumb, to look. But the perceives injustice, well, she uses examples now. Affirmative action. What is that? Is that a button that sore point with you? Do you immediately think, oh yeah, we were raising unqualified black people into positions and they were taking our jobs. They were taking positions that I would have had a shot at if I were a minority, but I don't get that opportunity because of affirmative action. And she goes into a lot of detail about the misinformation about affirmative action that she's stating here. She declares it's a flexible program. There aren't quotas or requirements. No employer is required to hire an unqualified person of color, but companies were required, and are in some cases still required, to articulate why they didn't hire a qualified person of color. And she says, and the requirement is rarely enforced. So the other thing is affirmative action never applied to private companies, only to state and government agencies. So I didn't know that. I'd never been taught that or had that explained to me. Copious research attests to the white disdain for African Americans with these particular traits, with these particular thought processes. The school to prison pipeline, mass incarceration, white flight, from where we live to how we determine who goes to jail and who does not, who gets cut some slack, who does not. It says that most whites say they would prefer, this is her statement here, that neighborhoods be no more than 30% black. We can be comfortable with some tokenism, but don't get it more than 30%. It's an interesting concept. I don't know what would make me uncomfortable, at what state I would say, oh, I'm beginning to be the minority here. How does that work for me? How does that make me feel? And we've talked about white flight, but it says that's triggered when a neighborhood reaches 7% black. White housing demand tends to disappear when more than a few black families are located in that particular area. And then the opposite of that is if there are areas that suddenly become in high demand because jobs are available in those areas, we have a new concept that has come out called gentrification. And this has happened particularly in areas like Brooklyn, Harlem, Oakland, Seattle are prime examples where I think one of the comedians on Saturday Night Live, he does his a black version of Mr. Rogers, and he says most of his neighbors now are white because gentrification means that the white people move in and the black people disappear. It was an interesting concept, made me laugh. But basically the question is, do we not want to integrate with black? The highest level of segregation is still in America between black people and white people. Then the other thing we have to always ask ourselves when we're looking at some of the issues about the protest, particularly against police violence, would we tolerate such behavior against a white person in that neighborhood? A boy, I've walked through undeveloped homes that were under construction, and I don't think I would tolerate being chased down in a community. The little child shot playing with a toy gun in the park, those kinds of issues. It also says that we see anti-black sentiment in the rejoinder, the comeback to Black Lives Matter, that when we say all lives matter or blue lives matter, we're dodging the issue that the people are saying when they say Black Lives Matter. And then she goes on talking about the conflicts with the neo-Nazis and the white supremacists marching, and how different people assessed that, how that came about, how it became politicized. So anti-blackness, she says, is rooted in misinformation, fables, perversions, projections, and lies. And she asks the question, do we as white people have deep within us a guilt about the history of our American culture, what has been done, what the white dominance has done and continues to do to people of color? White supremacy is a form of trauma that's stored in our collective bodies, not only for those who have been the victims of it, but those who know that us or our ancestors or at least our culture has been the source of such things. And that is a trauma. When I realize the true history of our culture and of our nation, it is hard to carry that and not feel a sense of guilt about it. What do we do? So she gets to this point: if African Americans are not alone in this, it's a different but equally real form of trauma lives in the bodies of most white Americans. Our projections allow us to bury this trauma. She's accusing this of us, of dehumanizing and then blaming the victim. You see, if blacks are not human in the same ways that we white people are human, our mistreatment of them then doesn't count. We are not guilty. They are. If they are bad, then it isn't unfair. In fact, it's a righteous thing that we're doing, protecting us, ourselves and our values and our culture. So she looks back and says, you can find pictures of the smiling faces of a white crowd picnicking at lynchings, the mass incarceration where we know that the percentage of black versus white in prison is huge. White righteousness inflicting pain on African Americans is evident with the glee in white collective. The white collective derives from such things as blackface, depictions of blacks as apes and gorillas. As I was telling you about the incarceration, you could get caught with powder cocaine, especially as a white person, and you might get a fine, you might get some community service. But if you were caught with crack, which was what was popular in the poorer areas of town, which tended to be people of colors, there was mandatory sentencing. It was a great injustice done there in those cases. So it says that we don't have a lot of concern for those who are at the bottom of every social and economic measure. If we could point to that not being the case, then we might have a stronger leg to stand on. But it truly is the fact that this is the reality. The poorest people tend to be people of color. So whites can only be white if someone is not white, if someone is the opposite of white. So the dream of the perfect world is a place unpopulated by whites. By blacks. In other words, the dream of the perfect world is a world, and I don't, I read that and wonder, do I really? And I don't, but I do think that we struggle with the percentages, and I do think that I'd struggle with me being the minority in such cases. I have a fluttering fear when that happens. White identity depends on, in particular, on the projection of inferiority onto blacks. And again, we may not see this in a conscious way, but we have to examine the unconscious ways that it shows itself to be true in us. And that's the only thing she's asking us to do. Will you question it? So she said, I believe the white collective fundamentally hates blackness for what it reminds us of, that we are capable and guilty of being prejudiced, of being oppressive, of using other people for our benefit and our resource. So you look back and you see the ways that that has been done, from welfare cheats to welfare queens to people being ungrateful, to the just the other ways that we look for any way to take offense. If someone's protesting and people riot or loot, we focus on the riot or loot because it keeps, in many ways, it's a convenient way not to have to deal with why the people were protesting in the first place. It says the trigger for white rage is inevitably black advancement. Black people with ambition, with drive, with purpose, with aspirations, demanding full and equal citizenship. Is that not something that terrifies you and me? She's asking us to consider that. It's complex, it's confusing, it's deeply rooted and hard to get out of us. We have these problematic racial narratives. We carry these token stories that we pull out of our pocket when it's time to defend ourselves. And then she gets into the movies, which is how I wanted to hopefully get us into this. So think on those things, pray about it, because again, if we are Christians, then we are transformed into the kingdom of God, the new creation, the recreation of what God is doing in us and through us, where there is no white or black, male or female, Jew nor Greek, but all of us together as the children of God. And all I'm asking is, as the people who are in this place in this time, what are we going to do to make that differently? And I'm hoping that as we get into this book a little further, we're going to start getting into some more concrete ideas of what that means, how we should behave. All right. God bless. I will talk to you about this next week. See you to worship on Sunday. At least the 2 or 3 of you that might still be watching.